Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Autism and LGBTQ plus identity. My name is Maya Leonardo. I use she or Z pronouns, and I am the Marketing and Development Coordinator at the New Haven Pride Center. Before we begin the evening's program, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which we are hosting this event. The New Haven Pride Center was founded and operates on the traditional lands of the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac peoples. We hope from wherever you are, you take a moment to acknowledge and honor the native people whose lands you occupy and the history of the place you are in. Find out more about native lands at native-land.ca. Now, I am excited to welcome you to tonight's program. We're going to be talking about autism and LGBTQ plus identity, an area where there is significant overlap. Autism has been found in a number of studies to correlate with LGBTQ plus identity, confirming what autistic advocates have been hypothesizing for years. One potential reason for this correlation is found in autistic people not fitting in with allistic or non-autistic society, and thus not fitting in with cisgender heterosexual norms. This evening, we're going to talk first about how we relate to our queer identities through the lens of autism. Autism isn't something we can turn off or experience less of the traits of, and our artistic experience extends to our experience of our gender identities and sexualities. Many of the struggles that the autistic community has faced in our quest for acceptance and recognition are similar to struggles that the LGBTQ plus community has experienced and is experiencing. Finally, before we begin, we would like to thank our sponsors who made tonight's program possible. Thank you, Connecticut Humanities, for all of your support. Your support helps facilitate important conversations like this one. If you would like to know more about sponsoring programs like these, please feel free to reach out. I would also like to take a moment to thank today's ASL interpreters, Adrienne and Nick, and thank you to Nick for coordinating ASL interpreting and all of the amazing interpreters that we work with to make our programming more broadly accessible. Now, let us begin our program and introduce our panelists. First up is Alex.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alex. My pronouns are she, her. Nice to see everyone.
Next up, we have Milo.
Friends, my name is Milo and I use they, he pronouns. Good evening.
Finally, we have Quell.
Hi everyone, I'm Quell and I use AM pronouns.
Cool. How are we all doing tonight? Cool, so let's get into this. So studies, as I mentioned, have found a correlation between being autistic and identifying under the queer umbrella. You're all queer and autistic. What do you think are the reasons for this correlation?
Yeah, I can tackle that that one first. People often talk about the seemingly higher rates of queerness among autistic people, and Maya, I think your preface addressed it very well. That to a large extent, it's a matter of not fitting in. A lot of people have this idea that, because rates of being LGBT are higher among autistics, there must be some innate predisposition to being LGBT among autistic people. And I can't say that I agree with that. I think that it really is a matter of not easily conforming to the standards that are demanded of us by society at large, particularly in the realm of sexuality and gender. For us autistics who are LGBTQ, I think that we have a harder time internalizing the gender and sexual roles that are imposed upon us, such as heteronormativity, cisnormativity, etc. We already have a hard time with the behavioral and communication expectations put on us by allistic society. And to me, it seems perfectly logical that this would impact our ability to repress our queerness, to change our expression of who we are, to conform to external expectations.
Yeah, that's all very true. That I don't know. Yeah. Alex, Milo.
Um, yeah, I think with what Cole was saying too, we had you see that there's a lot of studies that are being done right now that are trying to determine why is there like a 60% overlap here, and everybody, you know, they always are looking for a neurological reasoning. And I mean, the model that we use a lot in the queer community is like, you know, orientation, gender, sexuality, attraction types aren't choices. And we also use the model like for like with autism, and it's like it's a different, we understand it primarily as a different neurological, like a different neurotype, a different neurological wiring. But these studies in particular are not focusing on like what Quell is saying about how being autistic may cause our brains to have like a flexibility, or our outlooks, or and not necessarily conform to what like heteronormative society says is the norm. And it opens us to different types of input, different types of experience, even within the queer community. And the types of studies that are going on, if they really wanted to try to locate a single like biological overlap, autism itself is not simply something that's like a brain, like it's not simply something everyone's looking in the brain for this magical place of origin, but it's a totalistic biological wiring. So you see differences in like the immune systems, in neurology, and even like sometimes like in gastroenterology, things like that, almost on like a cellular level. So if people are really going to try to find a true correlation between the two identities, they're going to have to look from a medical perspective, in my mind, at multiple systems in the body instead of just trying to pin it in this one central thing about the brain.
Yeah, Milo.
So, two ways I kind of want to frame this is that it's really difficult for anyone to talk about anything when the person lacks the language to describe what's happening or can't intersect with community. I think autism breaks the binary, period, because being neurodivergent is not monolithic, and neither is LGBTQ plus. It's beyond spectrum. It's like some 3D sphere stuff, you know? And once you step outside of the binary when it comes to neurodivergence, and you realize that it's literally infinite diversity in infinite combination. Thanks for the snaps, Qual. Somebody got the reference. And for me, the similarities are quite stacked. These two intersections, the autism and the neurodivergence, really make me feel like me.
Yeah, great answers, everybody. Yeah, gives us a lot to build on. So, many autistic people who are also part of the LGBTQ plus community report that their autism has significantly affected their perception of their queer identity. Concepts such as autigender, or a gender identity so linked with autism to be indistinguishable from it, have sprung up. And so I ask you this: how has being autistic, or knowledge of yourself as autistic, affected your experience of your gender identity, sexuality, or both? I don't know. For me, it's hard to know where the autism ends and the transness begins, or vice versa. That like I don't know what it's like to be trans and allistic. It's like all I know is viewing the world and the way I relate to the world through an autistic lens, and like yeah, I have no frame of reference. Like all I know is that like I've always felt kind of disconnected from my body, not able to recognize myself in photos. And once I started transition, I kind of had that self image where I was able to say, hey, that's me.
Um, if I can, not to go first again, but yeah, I think for me personally, throughout my life, I think that one thing that is true is that the experience of being autistic is in many ways about being able to identify what I am not. When um, when I was growing up as a kid, I knew that in many ways that I was not like other kids. I didn't talk like them. I didn't act like them. I didn't process emotions in the same way. It was almost um, going off of something you said, Maya, almost as if I was external to them, almost alien in a way, which is something autistics have been talking about forever, this sense that we're from another planet. And as I got older and I became aware of myself sexually and became aware of gender and all that, I realized that there were a lot of ways in which I was not like other people there too. Um, I didn't really get the idea of having a very fixed or rigid sexuality, um, and the idea that some people just, you know, like had an almost hostility to the idea of, well, what if you were attracted to what if you're attracted to someone in a non-heterosexual way, or in regards to gender, just the norms of dress and speech and behavior just didn't seem to make any sense to me, and I could tell that other people processed these things almost as if they put much more of an importance on them than I did. And so I think that autism shapes ideas of gender and sexuality in that way, because if you're perceiving everything in a very different way, if you're relating to every societal norm differently than the people around you, if someone says, based on the body parts you were born with, you are a boy, you know, what's going to obligate me to say, okay, sure, I believe that. Yeah, I think you're right that these things are so intertwined, that almost inseparable.
Yeah, going off of what Quell said too, I had a very similar experience, growing up too. The idea of, like you feel like you're kind of an alien, like what planet did you come from? Like from when you're younger, and nothing quite fits. So you're kind of doing like you're trying to figure out where you fit by exclusion or negation, by saying, well, it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this, and it's not this. But why can't it be both of these things, or why can it be none of these things? And I've noticed that, like, in my case, growing up, my autism shaped my self-discovery, because I think some people very inherently know that, like, they may be different from their peers, and I did too, but I sort of took everything at face value. So in my environment, I interpreted the world as just being what my environment was at that exact time. And so I'm like, I don't fit here, and there are no options other than what is exactly in my environment. And so growing up in a small town, conservative town, mainly, no minorities, no queer representation, I didn't even know that was a possibility for me as a person until I was in my mid-20s. And I specifically attribute that to the way my autistic brain looks at the world, because it wasn't like a repression thing. It wasn't like internalized fear. It was more like, oh, here's another option you just never considered, and you went out in the world and found it. Oh, and this one fits better than the other. But still, everything always feels like you're kind of falling through the cracks a little bit.
Yeah, you can just start talking, Milo.
Okay, I just wanted to just sort of stack on what you guys were saying. Again, lacking the language and lacking a community around you is like lacking mirrors. Everything is sort of this undifferentiated gray thing, because there's not someone to say, you're not just the not this thing, you're not just the outsider, you could be part of this embrace, really, which is what it feels like when you finally understand it. It has always brought me a sense of relief to understand that I was not alone, that there were many that understood and could be mutually supportive with me, but because those intersections were stacked. And it's a good time to say that other intersections also stack with these things, like race and disability, very heavily too.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the autistic community has generally abandoned labels of high functioning or low functioning, the label of Asperger's syndrome, and person first, for example, person with autism, language, in favor of simple identity first language like autistic person. Do you see parallels in language to describe the autistic community coming from the autistic community, a rejection of external labels, and the LGBTQ plus community's experience of defining itself?
I think that this is a really great question, because I think that there are very clear parallels in the LGBTQ community. There's the use of the word queer, which a lot of people find to be a very comforting word, something that really describes the diversity of their experience. Some people have a very negative view of it because of the ways it has been used to hurt. With the identity first versus person first language too, I think that there is a degree to which a lot of it is imposed externally, where non-autistic people have this mindset of, oh, we have to use person first language because a lot of abled, a lot of non-autistic people like to shy away from neurodivergence. They like to shy away from what makes a person different. But just like there are compelling reasons why LGBT people might not like the use of the word queer, I think that it's something I've been thinking about, that there are legitimate reasons why someone might prefer person-first language, because so many of us have been dehumanized, and there are reasons why we might want to be seen as people first and foremost. I personally use identity first language, but I think that it just really highlights the diversity of our communities, and the fact that to jump off of something that Milo said earlier, that it's not monolithic, that it's always a spectrum of infinite combinations, and it can be tricky to navigate, but yeah, I don't have a good closure to my point there, just that the parallels are definitely there.
I think that from what I've seen, at least because I've been active more on autistic Twitter in the past couple years, I think like the autistic identity, the neurodivergent identity, and I see those as two separate things too, because people are still finessing the language. But I've noticed that it's more still in its infancy of creating an identity, and so people are still trying to find the appropriate words, because there are some people who like want to stick to the DSM definitions, the old ones that got discarded. There are some people who want to just use person first, some people who want to use identity first, and I think as the community continues to strengthen and find its way, it's going to actually probably find more and more precise words of description, because I know like a lot of autistic brains, we love that precision, we love the detail orientedness, and so I think it's still like in flux, like as it's growing. And like in the queer community, we have ever evolving labels and identities that we're putting words to, and we're a little further ahead, I think. But if you just take the autistic community as a neurotype, the neurotype part of the community, trying to define autism itself and how one experiences it, I think it's going to continue to grow.
Yeah, and so Milo, I'd love to hear your input on this, but a question was asked in the chat about the difference between person first language and identity first language. Person first language would be saying person with autism or X has autism. Identity first language would be saying oh, they are an autistic person or they are autistic. So, Milo, do you want to weigh in on this?
I know where my preferences certainly lie. In referring to myself and others, I'm always an autistic trans person. To me, that feels more holistic. I mean, we're all persons. This is me. It's a distinction, or we'll say it's a difference with less of a distinction. I feel more alienated by doing it the other way.
Yeah, it's important that like the language to describe us is language that we feel comfortable with.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make. And I think this has been affirmed in other marginalized communities, particularly those of color, which is nothing for us without us. I know that sounds super obvious, but the number of times cis allistic folks have talked over and talked about the experience of autistic and not non-standard people in general get described by people claiming to be standard all the time, and that ends up being damaging.
Yeah, for sure. So, what stigma have you experienced due to being autistic? What if that stigma comes from within the LGBTQ plus community?
I'd uh I'd actually like I'd actually like to start out by saying that out in the world, it seems like the stigma is there all the time. I experience it that way personally, but in the LGBTQ community, that is one of the places that I have experienced it the least out of every community that I've been in. And like that's something I'm grateful for, because I know there's overlap with our neurotypes, but also just I think the community itself is just more welcoming. In the larger community, there's certain patterns. The stigma that I mainly experience is like, it has to do with social cues predominantly. Like if you're interacting in a predominantly neurotypical society, and you're missing a cue, or you're giving body language off that doesn't match what you're supposed to, it sort of is almost like an ableist vibe that comes off of the neurotypical person, where they start to assume that you're less intelligent, or they infantilize you a little bit. So like in conversations, they'll try to make decisions for you. They'll try to they won't weigh your opinion as much, because they think, oh, because she's missing the cues, it must mean that she has like a childlike mentality. And that certainly is not what's going on with any of us. I can guarantee we're all like grown adults and with complex identities. And there's also a tendency to not be believed as much. I know a lot of us sometimes have like sensory sensitivities and extra perceptive, or we're extra perceptive about certain things in our environment, and others don't see or hear them, smell them. And when we point out our observations, people are saying like, no, you're exaggerating, you're attention seeking, you're not. And I'm like, I'm sorry that, I can hear the coax cable is loose and no one else can hear that. And so that's the stigma is mostly social, and it's an uphill battle, because you always have to convince somebody that you are competent. That's what I feel like. Like it's not even a validity thing. You always have to fight to have your voice heard, that you are competent and that you are not like a teenager. You're not making something up. You just are experiencing the world differently. And people need to stop and listen to you, because what's coming in is different. And so your experience is still valid, but just because they don't perceive it the same way doesn't mean that it's not happening.
I just wanted to hop in and sort of affirm what you're saying, Alex. I think this happens not only socially, but interpersonally at large, including in professional settings and work settings for people. I think that is one of the most difficult challenges, as differences themselves are stigmatized in certain professional settings as well. To not fit the boilerplate is dangerous emotionally, socially, and professionally in some circles. And if you add in a layer of queerness on top of that, I think that creates a sort of rolling stress that you sustain your entire life. The stigma is not being understood and then having to educate.
Yes.
And I wanted to just add on to that it doesn't even necessarily require the people who are doing the stigmatizing, the people who are viewing you negatively to even necessarily know anything about your neurotype or know explicitly that you are autistic. I saw it was a tweet or something on Facebook where it was like, how did it take me like 20 years to learn that I was autistic, but fifth grade girls on the playground were like, there's something wrong with this person. And it's like, you know, just by virtue of being the weird one, of being different, that stands out, and that can, like Milo said, cause all sort of professional, emotional, social ramifications. It really underlines how hostile society can be to divergence.
I just wanted to jump in one other thing I thought of, because Milo and you were both saying about danger in particular, and one area that like isn't really talked about a lot is medical discrimination too. Like there's a huge overlap of like it's either maybe via genetic or environmental susceptibility. I know a lot of autistic people have comorbidities with physical chronic illness. And when you go into a doctor's office, those same doctors are thinking, well, something's a little off with this person. And as you're describing something that may not be typical to begin with, you're running into a translation issue at the front end. And then you're also running into the bias. And then, as Milo mentioned before, the identities, one on top of the other. So you're queer, you're autistic. And if you need like medical assistance in particular, there is not a lot of research out there about how autistic bodies react to things as in like Western medicine. And there's, again, also there's the lack of knowledge plus the bias you go in as you walk in the door, that same translation, neurotypical, neurodivergent, you're othered as soon as you walk in, and that immediately affects your quality of care. So that's my PSA. Like if you suspect something's wrong with you, you have to advocate very hard with the doctors.
I want to build off what Milo mentioned about being autistic in the workplace and ask about being autistic in the workplace. So I'm going to ask y'all, how do you navigate the labor market and the workplace as an autistic person? Do you disclose that you're autistic at work? If you have you received any accommodations?
I'd like to say that no matter what I've done regarding the disclosure and non-disclosure of my autism, it's never worked out well. It always happens that I will be, historically, every single time, misunderstood, misinterpreted. It's it's really exhausting, actually, because, and to talk about the medical, what you were talking about, Alex. If you happen to know more, if you info dump on a medical professional and you say, well, let me tell you about that enzyme, and they're like, oh my God, you're done. You're crispy. You won't get good care, because if you threaten someone's sense of authority in a medical profession simply because of your non-neurotypicality, you're in trouble. But we were supposed to be talking about the workplace. Sorry, Maya.
No, you're good.
I feel like I don't have too much to add here, unfortunately, because I'm actually disabled and unable to work. But when I was able to work, most of my life before I became disabled, I didn't know I was autistic. So there wasn't like a worry about disclosure. But the one job that I was able to have, I chose not to disclose. And it was the same with my queer identity. I chose not to disclose because I felt like if I disclosed, there was going to be something about either disability that fell on me, or all of a sudden, like Milo was saying, like my authority was, I was going to lose any authority. I had a lot of authority in that job because I passed as neurotypical, and I mean, it was an IT job, and you get a lot of like,
There's a lower bar.
yeah, and you get a lot of like neurodivergent overlap in those kinds of professions, and I sort of passed there, so I didn't want to disclose, because I just felt like it is not good if you're going to disclose, because as soon as you do, you start getting perceived differently. It doesn't help you in any way. Like, you don't get the accommodations you need. You don't, like, instead everybody starts talking to you, like I said before, like you're a child. And so the flip side of that is you get to keep your authority, but you kind of don't fit in socially still, and you're seen as maybe like aloof, like you have personality problems, like maybe they think you don't like your coworkers, and it's not true. I mean, you're not like vibing with everybody like it's an episode of The Office or something, and people notice that you don't do that, but they don't know why, and so they attribute it to a judgment or personality, something coming towards you. That's been my experience, but I'd rather take that than the opposite, which is like, then all of a sudden everybody has red flags go up because they think disability, we've got to get this person out, at will hire it, they'll find a reason, and so you become a liability.
Yeah, I wanted with regards to accommodations, it can be so risky to ask for accommodations. But what I've found to be, like, I personally have never done it, and I don't disclose being autistic at work, because there is a degree of risk. But with regards to accommodations, one thing I've seen from a lot of other people is that, phrasing something as like a casual request, like, hey, it's too bright, where my desk is. Could we get a like a window shade, or could we move my desk? Like something just very off the cuff, might get respected. But the same thing phrased as an accommodation or accessibility request can cause, the same exact thing, just phrased differently, can cause the workplace to act like they're being so put on that it's such a big deal to provide this accommodation, if they're even going to grant it at all. When it comes to disability, when it comes to autism, so many people seem to have this notion that we either need to get over it, or, in very egregious cases, some people have this idea that we just shouldn't be in the public sphere at all. And to touch on what both of you mentioned about displaying competence, not even in a way that is trying to be confrontational, just expressing that something about what another person does. There's such a degree to which people get defensive when asked to provide something simple, defensive when you are acting in a way that is different than how they act. And it's just, all of these things are so tied together, and it makes employment as an autistic person a very challenging affair.
A few of y'all mentioned passing is neurotypical. So I've known this to be called masking, the process of compensating for autistic traits in order to more effectively blend in as allistic and avoid some of the stigma of autism. Do you see parallels with blending in as cisgender heterosexual to mask queer identity and avoid stigma?
I definitely do. I know that even in New York City, even in this day and age, there are times where I'll be walking with my wife down, the street, and we'll be holding hands, and I'll get a rush of panic of, what if this is the time that someone, decides to do something really egregious, that, it's still a danger to present as queer, when it shouldn't be. And it can be a very dangerous thing to present as autistic. I often like to, one thing that a lot of autistic people do is to rock back and forth as a soothing self-stimulus. A lot of us do it when we are very emotionally overwhelmed, but sometimes I like to just do it because it just feels, it just feels good. It's like sitting back in a rocking chair. But I often suppress that urge while I'm in public, because it's the sort of thing that could cause the people around me to say, what's wrong with that person? And I think tying back to some of the themes we've covered of repression, I think that masking as queer and masking autistic are two sides of the same coin.
And can I just say, I really think ultimately how you choose if your interface for masking or not masking can be considered a choice. That when it comes to passing or masking, that I envision a world that requires neither, and the abolition of these things is liberation.
Absolutely. I think in terms of masking, I feel like I've felt, I think, like we were talking about before, everybody who's autistic is, it's such a big spectrum. I think Milo said, like, we can't even think of it linearly. It's like a globe, and like with all different points. And the way the way I've experienced my autistic tendencies is that I have a reduced sense of danger. And so that's very dangerous, because I know that I have a reduced sense of danger. But when I go out in the world, I don't mask. I mask more consciously than unconsciously, but it's not due to danger. I end up kind of masking because I realize if I don't do this one thing this way, I can't get what I want. So like if I have to ask somebody in the grocery store to, do something for me, and I know they're neurotypical, I have to think to myself, okay, script. What's the script I run in my head that they need to hear so that they will give me what I need? Because if I ask for it the way I would ask for it, they will immediately say no. And so, we probably have multiple masks too, like for different situations. And like my default mask that I go to is actually to, hello world, I'm disclosing this to everybody right now. Like my default mask when, confronted with a stranger is to lean into the way they perceive me. They want to perceive me as naive and childlike and innocent. And I'm 36 years old. I mean, no, I'm not. But like, if they start doing that to me, a defense mechanism will kick in where I'll lean into how they're perceiving me to sort of like, the 4 Fs, like it's almost like a fawning masking where like you just show them what they need to see. And that means that you're not in as much danger, but you really know what's going on. And you hopefully try to get what you want. But it's hard because then you get coded as that person to the other. And you have to then fight to be like, no, I'm not 15. No, I'm not I'm not like I don't behave like an anime chick, like in my day-to-day life, like you saw me that way. I saw it back that you needed to see me that way. So I put that mask on. And it's very hard after a while when you're shuffling masks, like, to figure out what's underneath all of them. Like, you almost have to be with your closest intimates or by yourself to be able to take the mask off if you're so used to wearing it.
Like to change gears a little bit. Well, not change gears, maybe like a second to third gear shift. Nothing wild. So, many LGBTQ plus people have experienced efforts to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. Have you faced similar efforts aimed at making you less autistic, or um, have you been forced to mask by people or institutions?
Can I just say I think all institutions require this? It's by their nature, they're crushing. Top heavy hierarchy requires it. It's the sacrifice of participation, and that means healthcare systems, religious, educational. Certainly applies to academia. Oh my goodness.
Mm.
This is one of the heavier questions for this webinar. I think that my entire childhood was an attempt on the part of my biological mother to mold me into a normal person, capital N, capital P. Not to teach or provide guidance and assistance or help me navigate a world that was confusing and distressing, but rather to eliminate those differences, to train them out through a variety of tactics, things that, I thought then and I still think now are just completely innocuous, things that have no bearing on the grand scheme of life, like slightly, clashing outfit patterns. That's a very mild example, but something that shouldn't matter to anyone. But if you're so laser focused on having a child who is normal, on having a child who fits in, you sort of hone in on home in, like a homing missile, home in on any of those expressions of difference, no matter how big or small. And there certainly were a lot of big things. I don't want to go too far into that, but yeah, it's the sort of thing where if you don't have an adequate support structure, you have people who are trying to just who view you like unbaked clay, in need of molding into something real, into something valuable to the world, when we're valuable just the way we are.
Absolutely. Your story is very similar to mine. And I mentioned earlier, like, I come from a very small town, wasn't very diverse. So it's very narrow for what you were supposed to be to begin with, and then very narrow what you're exposed to. But unfortunately, the people in my life, and it wasn't just thankfully I didn't experience like actual behavior modification, but I've seen more therapists than anybody ever wants to know. From when I was young, I was sent there because people didn't quite have an understanding of what was going on with me, because I'm growing up in the late 80s, 90s, and they didn't think that girls could be autistic. And so you get thrown into a system that might not be serving you correctly, and then you're put on medications and you're sent to therapists, and all of it is not actually addressing what they want to address, which is I don't want you to be you. I want to send you to these therapists, send you to these psychiatrists like a broken toaster, and have you come back like you got repaired. And there's nothing to repair about being autistic. Like, and also it's very unsafe, because if you're getting put on medications or diagnosed erroneously with a mental illness that you don't have, or that follows you everywhere for the rest of your life. And you internalize shame when you're younger about it, and then you realize, like, oh, all of this was happening because it was an attempt to fix something that just was not understood and that actually didn't need to be fixed.
Yeah. So, going off that idea of things that don't need to be fixed, um, the social model of disability developed by disabled people holds that people are disabled by barriers in society rather than any impairment or difference. For example, the disabling factor in being deaf is not being hard of hearing, but existing in a society where people don't know sign language. So, how do you see this social model of disability relating to autism?
I'll just jump in and say I think probably the impediment that I find the most monumental and disturbing is the absolute outright denial that autism exists, and that its existence in people causes differences that one should respect. I know that that sounds incredibly basic, but ultimately, I feel like getting people to the point where they can even acknowledge that there is a social impact to it. It's bizarre to feel this invisible, but I think to bring it back to masking and passing, um, the more we vociferously refuse to mask, and the more that we celebrate not passing, the more space we make and maintain for ourselves. Right now, the model says that we don't even exist. It's pretty hard. Socially, you don't see any autistic accommodations in most workplaces. It's more like, well, if you can't handle it, don't work here. Literally.
I think the social model of disability, that the disability is caused by the lack of accessibility in society itself, to be so important, because it speaks to things beyond its scope. With regards to disability, with regards to so many things, there's the idea that a lot of people have that things are just innate. Things have some innate, inalienable nature that impacts the world, that the inalienable nature in things is what affects the world, rather than just the state that the world is in impacting things. In, as LGBT people, we talk a lot about things being social constructs. Gender is a social construct, the social construct of sexuality, the very conception of heterosexuality versus homosexuality, the way that we think about these things, the language that we give them. And being a social construct doesn't mean that these things don't have real impact and power in the world, but the social model of disability is so important because it lifts that veil of, oh, you only have one leg. Well, your life is like trans historically, like, you know, throughout all time, your life would be difficult because of this difference, rather than the world is failing to respect you and provide what you need. I just think it's such an important concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, well, you said it like perfectly. Like that's like I'm in addition to, I don't consider being autistic being disabled. Although I know some people don't share that view. Like I also have like a layer of like, you know, physical disability that I have experienced, and like in the disability community, separate from the autistic community, like that's absolutely it. Like, and then my, like with the invisibility, I feel like you add everything together, we're always screaming. I don't know why we are invisible, like more so, but like everyone feels like, you know, if everyone is suffering, it's okay. And I'm like, not it like everything's equal. If we're all suffering together, it's still equal at least. And I'm like, no, like there are degrees of things. And with the disability model, it's been shown like if you increase accessibility for like, you know, one particular group, it actually increases accessibility for everybody. Like and in society, I almost view being autistic as, when we go back to the alien metaphor that we used a lot of like earlier, like if we feel like we're alien, like it's almost like a different neurotype requires different communication, requires different interfacing of understanding body languages. And neurotypical people like to tell us a lot. I know we're the minority, but they tell us a lot. You have to adapt to us. We're the majority. You have to adapt to what's around you. And what I say is, why can't we find a space where we're meeting each other in the middle? Because it is so hard for us. We're putting a lot of effort in to adapt, and it's not equitable, especially if a person who's neurotypical, they describe their experiences as having social fluidity and ease that we lack. That's one of the big things they tell us, like, you lack this social ease. But if they have it, why do they have so much trouble meeting us in the middle? Like we work hard, and I think we're going against the current. But like if we all met each other in the middle and looked at it more as like two different cultures that have to learn different social norms and methods of communication, like we can do that. I mean, granted, in this country we're not so great at it, but like we can do that for other cultures. Like we should also be able to do it for other neurotypes, with, and everything would open up more, because the more diversity, the more inclusivity there is, the more ideas are exchanged, the more everybody can benefit.
Great, everybody. So that brings us just about to the end of our time. We could probably keep going for quite a while. Y'all seem happy to talk and full of great ideas. Um, Let me pull up my closing. So, thank you again, Quell, Alex, and Milo, and thank you, our viewers, for joining us for tonight's program. Remember, the center is here for you year round with dynamic programming, support services, case management, and more. You can find out about all of our upcoming programming at newhavenpridecenter.org. Don't forget to follow our social media, including at New Haven Pride Center on Facebook, at New Haven Pride Center on Instagram, and at New Haven Pride on Twitter. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/c/New Haven Pride Center. Finally, if you enjoyed this evening's program, please consider joining as a member. It's free at newhavenpridecenter.org/join now, or making a donation to support our programming at newhavenpridecenter.org/donate. Thank you, and have a good rest of your night.